Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me. Episode 24, The Three Letters. Eric, you write in your book about how with retrospect you realise how difficult it was for your parents. Tell us about the visit to Chase Farm Hospital by your mother with Mrs. Cripps, the support worker from the Women's Royal Voluntary Service.
The one visit that I remember when my mother came was she brought a pile of comics, and I was interested in those. Somehow I'd also managed to get a tear in the seat of my shorts, and my mother got a needle and thread from somewhere, and I remember lying out on the grass on my face, and my mother sewing this tear in my trousers. Now, I was interested in the comics. My mother was a semi-stranger, and as far as I was concerned, the comics were far more interesting. Then after a little while, Mrs. Cripps whipped the comics away and said, "Your mother has come to see you all this distance. You've got to pay her some attention." And I think that telling off was thoroughly deserved, because as far as I was concerned, it was this lady, almost a stranger, who'd come to visit me, and so the comics were of more interest. But to my mother, of course, it was her very badly injured son, in very frequent pain, that she'd come to visit. And from her point of view, she was to blame for me being in that condition, because she had brought Kitty and me home from Wales. If she hadn't, we'd have been fit, although in Wales. Kitty had desperately wanted to go back to Wales for all kinds of reasons, but I was glad to be home. There was a reason why my mother had not come. My father told me this again very much later. He'd come home from work one Saturday, because he worked Saturdays, and there were three letters waiting for him. One was from the hospital where my mother was, and another was from the care home where Eddie was having to stay for time, that he'd fallen out of bed and broken his shoulder and was crying for him, and a letter from my hospital where they wanted to do an operation.
As you explained in an earlier episode, your mother had suffered a breakdown after a chance meeting with Kitty's Welsh foster mother at the communal grave of victims of the bombing in Hither Green Cemetery.
Kitty's foster mother, as soon as she saw my mother, screamed out at her, "You're to blame for my lovely Kitty's death." When my father got home that night from work, he found my mother was suicidal. And he phoned our GP, Dr. Armitage, I remember, and he was very good. He got her into a psychiatric hospital that night. That meant, of course, that Eddie had to go into care. With these three letters, the one had come from my mother's psychiatric hospital, saying that she was worse and had been put in a padded cell. And my father went to see her. And a padded cell in those days, I don't know what they call them now, was a special room where there was no furniture. There was a mattress on the floor, which was thickly padded, so a person couldn't injure themselves by bashing their heads against the wall or whatever. There was one light set in a cage high up in the ceiling, and there was a cross in the door of a window, so that wherever the patient was in the padded cell, they could be under observation. The bedclothes that went with the mattress were such that they were unrippable, so that a rope couldn't be made out of it for a person to strangle themselves. Their clothes were made of the same material, and of course they didn't have a belt or anything like that. My mother didn't tell me this in so many words, but from various comments that were made at different times, I've pieced that together. My father, having seen her, came on to see Eddie, and his shoulder, broken collarbone, was healing quite well, so that was no problem. And he was delighted to see my dad, our dad. But when he left, Eddie cried really bitterly, which must have been awful for my dad. He came on to see me and was relieved that the operation was what they would call an exploratory operation. It wasn't that my arm had got worse, it was just not getting better. And so what they wanted to do was to cut into that part of my shoulder and see if there was anything they could actually do with the nerves in that area. So my dad went home from me, at least moderately happier that I wasn't getting worse, and he hoped that the operation, of which the doctor spoke quite optimistically, he'd said, would do something for my arm. But what must have hurt him, and I didn't realise it at the time, in a different way that he was hurt when Eddie cried so bitterly, was that I was rather indifferent. I'd been evacuated from nearly 6 till 9, and seen him just once in Wales, as I recall. So he was a stranger. I came home and was home for 4 months before the bombing, and he was working late, so I was often in bed when he came home. He also had warden duty that he did, and he was away overnights at times, 2 or 3 times a week. And so he was even more of a stranger than my mother was. So to me, a stranger came that I knew very vaguely. He stayed for a little while, and I showed him around the hospital grounds a bit, and then he went, and I went back to my ordinary life. So I don't know if that hurt him. Probably it did, as I realised when I became a father myself.
To buy your copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.